A few years ago, I took a pottery class through USI. One night a week for 8 weeks, I traveled to a studio near Mount Vernon and worked with clay. I will not say that it was an unqualified success or an unqualified disaster. I will say that I will not be looking to pottery as a source of supplementary income in any imaginable future. However, it was an experience that continues to pay benefits. I have a whole new appreciation for pottery and potters. I'm always drawn to pottery. Whenever we are looking around shops, I can begin to imagine how those pieces were created, even though I could never create such a work of art myself. There are at least 2 ways to create pottery. One method, which I seem to have mastered a bit, was to press the clay into a sheet, flatten it out, and then create items with the help of forms and cutters. It was, in essence, an adult form of my old Play-Doh fun factory. If you could use a cookie cutter, you could do this. The other was the wheel. I watched the demonstration that the instructor gave. A lump of clay, positioned in the center of the wheel. Turn the wheel on and begin to further center the clay. Keep the clay just wet enough and then begin to pull the clay up from the wheel. When the clay doesn't respond, assert pressure. I watched as the clay came to life in the potter's hands. It danced up from the wheel and became a bowl as if by magic. My turn. Clay on the wheel. Turn the wheel on. Wet the clay. Pull the clay up from the wheel. Apply pressure. No bowl. Utter disaster. Clay that appeared alive in the teacher's hands was dead on arrival in mine. The lesson I learned was this. When creating pottery, it is about both the potter and the clay. The intimate partnership between the hands and the clay is critical if creation is to take place. The prophet Jeremiah visited a potter's house and watched a potter move the clay to life from the wheel. He saw the clay moving and pulsing with each turn of the wheel until it began to climb up from the wheel. He saw one form collapse and fall, and another rise to take its place. And then it hit him. This clay and this potter was a metaphor. This was not just a potter making vessels out of clay. This was a lesson about God and God's people. The people of God are clay on the wheel, and God is the potter, forming and creating, reforming and recreating. God's people are being formed and reformed into what God needs them to be and do in this world. With a little pressure here and a little water there, God draws people up from their inert, lifeless nature into vessels that can hold living water, new wine, and even the Spirit of God, and then pour out that creative power into the world around them. When the clay, that is the people of God, does not respond to the master's hand, the master potter pushes the clay down and begins again. The potter is prepared to overcome the clay's native and inborn resistance to be changed. The potter corrects the clay's resistance, not in some ham-handed way, but with gentle pressure and force to bring the clay into its assigned purpose and function. Now, any of you veteran sermon participants are already writing the end of the sermon. It's that obvious, isn't it? That this lesson is, at least in one way, a lesson about how God and God's people interact. This is a lesson, a parable, a metaphor for how God has a purpose for God's people and how God shapes and molds them for that very purpose, and how God's people sometimes resist and fight back against that molding and shaping, resisting and even rejecting the purpose for which God created them. You really can't miss it. But let that sink in for just a moment. We sometimes resist and even reject the purpose for which God created us. Think about that. There are times when we are the clay that informs the potter what we will be. We will be that God, but we won't be that. We will do that God, but we won't do that. There are times when we really say to God, perhaps not in so many words, but certainly by our inaction and our idleness, that we will chart our own course and be who we want to be. God, we will be your people, but don't ask us to feed the hungry. God, we will be your people, but don't ask us to care for those people who are so unlike us, whoever those people happen to be this week. God, we will do what you want us to do as long as it really doesn't demand anything of us. God, we will be a part of expanding your kingdom of love as long as we can do it for the same amount of money next year as we did this year. God, we will be your people as long as it doesn't change anything at all. And at that point, God's people become moldy instead of being molded. At that point, we cease to be what God created us to be and what God needs us to be. Instead of being fresh and innovative and life-changing, we become inflexible, stale, and a hackneyed parody of what God created us to be. You can actually smell it. You know that smell that comes from your bread drawer that tells you instantly that the bread has somehow gone bad? I visit lots of churches in my responsibilities for the Presbyterian. A lot of those churches are in very serious trouble. Some won't be around in a few years. And when you walk through their doors, you can smell it. It's a musty, moldy, rank aroma of mildew and decay. They have gone nose blind, as the commercial puts it, to just how little they resemble the people of God that they were created to be, and they care so little that they can't even eliminate the stench of idleness in their own building. But there are other churches, thanks be to God, that smell alive. These are churches that have no problem being molded and remolded by the hands of God to be whatever God needs them to be. These are churches that stop talking about problems and begin seeing opportunities. These are churches where the people of God, where being the people of God means taking risks and making sacrifices and going beyond past performance to do what God has for them to do. These are churches where service is more critical than survival. These are churches where life meets you at the door and carries you in. So the question is simply this: which would you rather be? Moldy or molded? Would you rather be a church that focuses inward and worries about how to care for itself? Or would you rather be a church that focuses outward and cares for those who need our care? Would you rather be a church that frets and worries about this and that, or would you rather be a church that has such confidence in its calling and in its God that risk is simply recognized as a part of being the people of God? Would you rather have a church that idolizes its past and mourns what is no longer present, or would you rather be a church that can't wait to see what God has in store in the days ahead? I always remember the story my friend in ministry told of visiting an elderly woman in her church. The pastor reviewed all the wonderful and amazing things that the congregation was doing. The lady was impressed. But then the lady said to her pastor, "Oh, I'm all in favor of progress. It's just all these changes I can't stand." And there we are. There we are. We want to be the clay in God's hands, but only if God allows us to inform God of what we shall become. It is frightening and intimidating and daunting to place oneself in God's hands with no strings attached. That is equally true for churches and congregations. But when we allow God to be the potter, and when we allow ourselves to be the clay, amazing things can happen. When we give ourselves to God without exception and without restriction, God molds and shapes us and uses us in ways that we could never foresee. When we surrender to God's desire for us, we begin to see new life all around us, and sometimes even within us. Back in our church camp days, we sang a song that I've never forgotten. It's a perfect little prayer when dealing with Jeremiah and his visit to the potter's house. You know it probably. Spirit of the living God, fall afresh on me. Spirit of the living God, fall afresh on me. Melt me, mold me, fill me, use me. Spirit of the living God, fall afresh on me. May we be molded and never moldy, for now and evermore. Amen.